What's up, jackalopes? I'm Hope, and today I'm bringing you my December wrap-up. I had a pretty good reading month in December. I only had one book under 4 stars. I read 6 books total, which is more than I usually read, which was very exciting for me. And I think the reason I read so much in December, I say so much, like more than usual for me, was because I was participating in the Reindeer Readathon that was hosted by Eric over at Break Even Books, and I will link his channel below. But I was on Team Snowflake, which was being led by Hillary from Melted Books. I will also link her channel below. And I think that having that interaction with other readers and doing the reading sprints every week and all of that really gave me a lot more motivation to read more than I usually do. And so that was just a lot of fun. And I'm really excited that I read 6 books in December because, again, that's more than I usually read. But I think to go through these, I'm just going to go through them in the order that I read them. That just seems like the best way to do it since I don't really have any hierarchy to how much I liked or disliked them. The first book I read in December was Spy X Family Volume 2 by Tetsuya Endo, which is the second installment in a manga about a spy named Twilight who needs to access this person who is kind of a notorious recluse. He only comes out to like events at his son's private school, and so in order to get access to this guy, to get some intel that he needs to try to prevent a war starting between his country and this other country, Twilight has to, on very short notice, get himself a child and a wife so that he can get his child enrolled in the private school where his target's son attends, so that he has a reason to be at school events. So it's kind of this very silly setup where he has to try and build a family really, really fast, like within a couple of weeks, and then try to get his daughter into this school. But the series really, beyond the kind of silliness of it and the kind of action sequences that happen, it's really about the relationships between the characters, and I absolutely love them. I gave Volume 2 5 stars. I gave Volume 1 5 stars too. I actually don't have my copy of Volume 2 because I lent it to my boyfriend so he could read it, because he also loved the first one. But the relationships between the characters are just so cute. They're just so sweet. And Volume 2 really developed the relationship between Twilight and his wife Yor a lot, and I really enjoyed that. So all in all, it was a really great book to start the month with. The second book that I read in December is The Empress of Salt and Fortune by Nebo. This is a fantasy novella following a cleric named Chi and their magic bird. Almost Brilliant, I think is the bird's name. And they are going around basically collecting histories and collecting stories so that they won't be forgotten. And they're intended to go to the capital of the empire for the crowning of the new Empress, which is set to take place in a few days or a week or so. But along the way they find themselves at this cabin where they encounter a woman named Rabbit, who turns out to be one of the handmaidens and one of the closest friends of the former Empress. And so while they're there, Rabbit begins to tell them the former Empress's story about how she was originally exiled before eventually using that to her advantage, the fact that she was overlooked to her advantage, to ultimately seize power and become the Empress, the actual ruling Empress. So I thought this was really interesting because it is very much about women who have been excluded from the narrative and how they have taken back control of the narrative and found power and a voice for themselves. And so I loved that aspect of this. With this over here, switch arms. And I also love that this is told in like little vignettes. So each section is Rabbit giving Chi and Almost Brilliant just a little chunk of the story, but the pieces slowly weave together to give you a bigger picture, both of Rabbit's relationship with the Empress and also with the Empress's plans and how she ultimately takes power. So this is just a really beautifully written story. This made me cry. I absolutely loved it. I read it all in one sitting. And I would highly recommend this if any of that sounded interesting to you, because I had just kind of like, I wouldn't say passing interest, but like I was interested in it, but it wasn't top priority for me. And then now that I picked it up, this is one of my favorite books I've read this year, and I feel like I immediately need to go out and get the sequel, When the Tiger Came Down the Mountain, which just came out. So I think that this is a book that will really just kind of blow you away. It's so good. The third book I read was Macbeth, and this was my one disappointment for the month because this is a book that I was supposed to have read in high school, and then the year that we were supposed to read it, there were some scheduling things and issues with not getting through previous things on our syllabus fast enough, and so we never got to it, and I was really disappointed because I thought that this was going to be like the Shakespeare play I liked. I read Romeo and Juliet the year before that, and I didn't really care for it, but Macbeth seemed like it was going to be the one that I was really going to like. It seemed like it would be right up my alley. Like murder and ghosts and intrigue, I was here for it. And then I didn't get to read it. And then I spent years hyping myself up for it, only to read it in December and be disappointed. And I think there's a couple of reasons for this. One of them, and I think the most major one, is that it feels like there's too big of a jump at the beginning of the play, that Macbeth, some ladies call him king while standing on a hill, like weird ladies who then disappear like the moment they've told him this, and he just goes, alright, I'll kill the king. Even though the very beginning of the play sets up that he's like this very loyal warrior for the king, and the king really likes him, and they have like a great relationship, and he just jumps to murder. That didn't make much sense to me. I did like how the prophecy played out. There's like this thing with prophecy about how he will be king until X thing happens, and I really liked the way that played out, but that was much more towards the end of the book, and so there was like this kind of first half that I didn't really care for. The other thing that I think impacted my enjoyment of it is that I really like to use audiobooks for Shakespeare plays, because something about the language just trips me up every time, but being able to hear it really helps. So I got this audiobook from the library, and it was a full cast audiobook. But none of the voices were different enough for me to really be able to differentiate between who was speaking. And so I spent most of the book not being able to tell who was talking. And it was supposedly an unabridged version, but then they had like cut out large chunks of the dialogue. So it was so hard to keep up with where I was and who was speaking that I think that kind of impacted my enjoyment of the play too. I think if I had like seen it as a play, which obviously I can't do right now because pandemic, but if I'd seen it as a play, I think I would have enjoyed it more. So after reading 3 really short things, I then decided to read, to reach behind me here, ACOWAR, A Court of Wings and Ruin by Sarah J. Maas. This is the 3rd book in the A Court of Thorns and Roses series, which follows Feyre, who ends up in the fairyland of Prythian after killing a wolf who turns out to have been a fairy. I don't want to say a whole lot about this book because it is the last book in a trilogy, but I feel like this was a pretty solid ending to this kind of first trilogy. There is a new book coming out in February that's starting, I think it's supposed to be another trilogy that follows Feyre's sister Nesta. But I felt like this was a pretty solid end to the first trilogy. It did a pretty good job of tying up enough of the plot that you didn't feel like things were just kind of, there weren't gaping holes at the end of the story, but it left a few interesting questions open that I'm hoping will be kind of the hooks into the next book. I do think the end of this book kind of pulls its emotional punches, because the end of this book could have had some really strong emotional impact, and then it just doesn't have that. It gets pulled at the very end and kind of blunted, and I just think that this could have been stronger if that hadn't happened. But aside from that, I mostly really enjoyed this book. I enjoyed getting more time with the characters that I've grown to love in this series, and I think there was some more interesting development with the relationships between different characters. So on the whole, I really enjoyed this. I just think it could have been a little bit stronger at the end. I am, however, looking forward to the next one. I have pre-ordered that one. I still need to read the novella, though. The novella. After that 700-page behemoth, I decided to go back to short books, and I read Burning Roses by S.L. Huang, which is a really interesting story that blends Eastern and Western folklore. So the 2 protagonists of this story are Hu Yi the archer from Chinese mythology, I think, and then Red Riding Hood, obviously from Western mythology. Her name is Rosa in this one. And it follows these 2 women. They're both middle-aged, but they go on a big quest to stop some sunbird attacks because these massive firebirds have been attacking the region that they live in. And so they go to this quest to an island to kind of get to the bottom of this attacks. So it sounds like there's a lot of plot in here, but this is another book that is very character driven. It's very much about the relationship between Rosa and Hu Yi. It's also very much, and I think even more so, about Hu Yi and Rosa coming to terms with their pasts and kind of figuring out how to move forward as better people. That is, I think, the primary thrust of the story. So if you're really looking for a lot of plot, this may not work for you as well, but if you really are wanting or looking for kind of character-driven fantasy, I think that this is really excellent title. I absolutely loved this. I read it in one sitting, kind of like the Empress of Salt and Fortune. I like sat down, read the whole thing immediately. This is another one that's really beautifully written, and I just really loved the characters at the end, even though they're very flawed characters, and I think that's part of their appeal. So I think that's really cool, and I absolutely loved this. And then the very last book I read in December is Play Like a Feminist by Shira Chess. This is a nonfiction book about feminism, playfulness, and video games. And it's kind of an introduction to all of these ideas. So it's talking in the beginning about feminism and kind of the main goals of feminism and why the author feels that feminism is important. It then goes on to talk about playfulness and the ways that we can use play as protest. So basically creating protest that uses laughter and uses play as a tool for change. And then the last section is about specifically the video game industry and how feminism needs video games as much as video games need feminism. That's the general concept here. I thought this was really well done. It's very accessible. I'm really into game studies, so this really appealed to me. And I think that if you have interest in any of those topics there, this is worth picking up, especially because it is very short and it's very accessible. So getting through it and kind of learning something new is really easy with this. And I absolutely loved this one as well. I really loved most of what I read this month, so this was just a strong end to a strong month. So these are all the books that I read in December, excluding the Spy X Family Volume 2 and Macbeth, because I unhauled Macbeth and I've lent my copy of Spy X Family 2 out. So imagine there's 2 more books on here. But this is everything I read in December, and I pretty much loved everything I read excluding Macbeth. And I didn't dislike Macbeth. So all in all, it was a really great reading month. I had a lot of fun with the readathon, and I'm just really excited going into the new year about all of the great books I get to read now. But that is all I have for you today, and I really hope you enjoyed this video. I've enjoyed making it and talking about all of these wonderful books. And I hope that I'll see you in the next one. So, bye.